Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad that I can present this video in HDR because that means we have actually native HDR in this game. But to be very honest, I wasn't worried about that. The real question here is, how good is HDR? Do we have any problems with the black level rays? Do we have any problems in regards of specular highlights? And what about HDR colors? Yeah, let's answer a couple of questions. Let's go. But as always, let's talk about the very important things first. Star Wars Outlaws does not support the HDR system level calibration, not on the Xbox, not on the PlayStation 5 and not on the PC. And because that's the case, we have HDR settings in the game. We have the brightness setting, we have the HDR peak setting, and we have the HDR user interface setting. So let's talk about the HDR user interface setting first, because this setting is purely just responsible for the brightness of HUD symbols on your screen, and you can change this setting as you like it. The next setting what we have is called brightness setting, and this setting is mainly responsible for the average picture brightness in the lower to mid and gamma. Also what I found, it is affecting slightly the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights and also the black level floor. And last but not least, we have the setting HDR peak brightness, and this one is the maximum peak brightness capability of your screen. So when you have a 1000 nit screen, you set this to 1000 nits. If you have a 2000 nit screen, you set it to 2000 nits. Sounds easy, but that's not the case, because I found actually a very minor issue with this setting. And now I would say let's start talking about the HDR implementation, about the quality of the HDR implementation in Star Wars Outlaws. And to have a proper HDR quality, to have a proper HDR outcome, you need actually two quality factors in my opinion. First is a very good HDR black level floor. Okay, so a game should be able to output 0 nits or very close to 0 nits to have not a washed out look. The other factor is, or the other quality is specular highlights. You must have, or you should have, a very bright, or the maximum peak brightness actually in specular highlights should match the maximum peak brightness capability of your screen. Otherwise, also the picture looks like slightly dim. Okay, so combine those two factors, very good HDR black level floor and very bright specular highlights depending on your screen capabilities. That means you should have a very good contrast. Contrast is very important when we're talking about picture quality. But what about the contrast in Star Wars Outlaws? And let's start with the HDR black level floor, or should I say the HDR black level rays, because unfortunately we have HDR black level rays in this game and there is no setting in the game to get rid of it. I tried everything, but even you change or decrease the brightness setting to -10, you will always have a black level rays of around 0.05 nits all the time. This counts for the PlayStation 5 version, the Xbox version and also the PC version. But what about specular highlights? What about the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights? And here I have good news, because here is no problem at all in this game, at least if you don't have a TV with a higher maximum peak brightness capability of 4500 nits, because that's the maximum what I was able to measure on the console and on the PC. Even the game actually, or the setting in the game tells us 5000. The maximum peak brightness is limited to 4500, 4600 nits. And that is the problem what we have with this HDR peak brightness setting, because the value what you set in the game doesn't match the output on your screen. So when I set this value to match my LG G2, which is 1000 nits roughly, the maximum peak brightness on the console and on the PC was just around 750 nits. So I had to increase this value to 1200 nits to have actually close to 1000 nits maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. And that's why my first recommendation is always add 200 nits in-game settings to the value what you like to use. So let's say you have a 1000 nit TV, 1200 nits is the value what you should set in the game, console and PC. If you have a 2000 nit TV, then set the value to 2200 to have really 2000 nits output. There's another HDR quality what you should have to have a proper HDR implementation. HDR Color Space in use, or HDR colors in general. And the question is, does Star Wars Outlaws uses the DCI P3 color space or the BT 2020 color space? And the answer is very simple, actually no. I just found one spot where there is some DCI-P color space in use, but the rest, or 99.9999% of the time, SDR color space. And yeah, like in a million other games. Okay, so we talked about the HDR black level raise in this game. We talked about the issue with the specular highlights, or the maximum peak brightness in specular highlights. We talked about that there is zero HDR color space in use. What about the quality actually of specular highlights in this game? And yeah, there is, where I tested the game, I'm roughly 2 hours in the game. There is not much to show off actually. It's a average HDR implementation in my opinion. And when you find some specular highlights, they are okay. They are well detailed. You can see actually differences in terms of brightness. And yeah, that's it. So it's nothing outstanding in my opinion. It's on an average level. Okay, so what is now my recommendation in regards of the brightness setting? And we talked about the HDR peak brightness setting already, but I like to repeat this as well. So what about brightness? Let's start with this first. So first of all, this setting is changing or can adjust the HDR black level floor slightly, very slightly, okay? So the problem what I found is that when you set this value to -10, let's say, to have some sort of a better contrast, first of all, you lose average picture brightness, and also you start losing actually maximum peak brightness and specular highlights. So that's why my recommendation is for the brightness setting, maximum -5. Maximum -5, do not increase this value, okay? Don't increase it. -5 is the maximum what you should set this value in my opinion, because otherwise you end up with a too dark picture and you lose specular highlights, maximum peak brightness and specular highlights. So again, the problem with this game is that there is always HDR black level raise regardless to what level or value you set the brightness setting. Again, -5, my recommendation. And I like to repeat this again, the HDR peak brightness setting is very simple. Always add 200 nits to the setting what you like to use. So again, if you like to use 1000 nits because you have a 1000 nits TV, then set this value in game to 1200. If you have a 1800 nits TV, then set it to 2000, and so on, okay? To make sure you have the proper maximum peak brightness output for your display. Okay, my friends, so it's time for our summary, and I'm a little bit disappointed, to be very honest, but as soon I learned actually that this, the Star Wars Outlaws is using the same game engine as Avatar's Frontier. What was the name? Avatar's Pandora? Avatars from Ubisoft. I was not expecting too much anymore. Okay, let's say it like this, okay? So I'm not saying that the HDR implementation is terrible in this game. It can be much better, okay? Let's be honest, okay? But it's also on a level where I can recommend use HDR over SDR. But in regards of that, I will prepare SDR versus HDR comparison video at a later point. I'm not sure exactly when. But right now, I would recommend to use HDR because you still have a much higher maximum peak brightness and specular highlights. And this is really actually on a good level. If you find some specular highlights in this game, because they are rare actually. So what you can see here right now, the neon stuff and whatever, this is actually not too bad. It's very bright and it looks good, but this is very rare, okay? So at least where I tested, or at this stage where I am in the game, okay? So I'm not saying that this is all the time. Maybe it changes in a later level or whatever, so let's see. But again, use HDR if you want. Wait for my SDR versus HDR comparison video, because I'm looking actually forward to it, because especially about the HDR black level raise compared to the SDR black level floor, I like to see if there is a big difference in regards of contrast. So because maybe it is even better to have, or to play in SDR and not to have specular highlights, very bright specular highlights, but a better HDR black level floor. So I'm looking forward for this video, and I say thank you very much for watching me this time. I'll see you next time. Bye.